to be, be like that too.
Right. Yeah. And he seems like someone that you wouldn't, he was someone not that you would feel like you should follow, but that you would want to follow.
Hmm. But he had that charism throughout his whole life, even before his conversion, because he was the one that initiated the parties and the gatherings of the young men of Assisi, and they would get together and sing songs and tell stories and dream about when they would become knights, and that was such a big that charism or that personality trait that was in Francis was never he God cashed in on that. That's
Yeah.
what I would say. God cashed in on that. So that's what makes it so exciting, and so that's why Francis is so lovable.
Yes.
I for me, that's the thing, is when people say, what I mean, I have a friend that's an imam that's really trying very hard to develop a Franciscan community within the Muslim community. And now that's when we talked about that, and when we've been talking about it, that's a real and that's a real stretch on many levels, and yet not.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I'll talk about that a little bit, and just kind of remembering who Francis is and was, because that would make total sense in terms of the relationship between Francis and the Sultan when Francis went for the fifth crusade.
I find that that's one of the depictions that gets worked from different directions. Some emphasize how ecumenical he appears, and then others say, oh no, it was all proselytizing, and once he knew that the Sultan wasn't interested, he abandoned that pursuit. It's the St. Francis can be used by people.
Well, yeah, and we can talk about that too, because even in the biographies of Francis, there are certain things that are in some biographies and certain things that are not, and that was very politically driven.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm only saying that because I talked to scholars who have been researching Francis. We have a 3-book series that's kind of like the omnibus courses for Francis.
Yeah, is it the early documents?
It has the that's an older one.
Okay,
I think
that's the first one.
Yeah, we had something called the Omnibus of Sources that came out in the 70s, and then just recently, in the last few years, there's a 3-volume set that walks through the writings of Francis, the story, the biographies of Francis, and the digging. So you're right, because people were concerned about how Francis would look if he was against the Crusades. And so some of the biographers would lean toward more that Francis wanted to apostolize the Sultan, but scholarship speaks a little bit differently from that. That would be a whole class in itself, because the relationship between the Sultan and Francis was something that never left Francis after he came back from his visit in Egypt.
Didn't he leave instructions for courteous behavior to his?
Well, actually, yeah. What Francis had said in the rule of 1220, in the first rule of the friars, I think it was in 1221, said that if you wanted to go amongst the infidels, that you would have permission to do that.
Mm-hmm.
The later rule doesn't call them infidels.
Okay.
And so it was this little bit of the language changed a little bit in the rule, but it meant a lot, because the story goes that when Brother Leo had gone to Francis and asked Francis to give him a blessing. And so Francis wrote a blessing for Brother Leo. And it was only after Francis had died that they discovered on the back side of this parchment was an image of a man with a turban.
Mm.
And he was very concerned about his friend, the Sultan, because the Pope was going to do a sixth crusade. And he was concerned about the life of his friend. And so, so that was one of the stories there.
That's incredible. All right, some people are starting to log in. Pat and Lorraine, can you hear me? They're working on it. Maxine, you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Advent Square, you can hear me? All right. Shirley, you can hear?
Loud and clear.
Okay. Remember, if you have a TV or radio on, we'll need you to turn that off.
Okay.
Comes through.
There we go.
Is this where you
Okay.
choose the device for?
And who is on Samsung SM?
BB.
Phoebe,
Uh-huh. I think
Does
that's
he
me.
have it muted?
that's probably you.
No.
Yeah.
Who's talking?
Who knows?
Zimmerman's?
Yeah.
Zimmerman's, you got me now?
Lorraine and Pat have their thing on mute.
Yeah. They're on mute. They should be able to hear us, though.
Right.
He's been successful before, probably.
He- And-
Susan, you can hear?
Yes,
All right, good. And I know Mickey's on. She's muted, but she's in her room. Okay. Oh, boy. Here comes the crowd.
Hello, everyone.
That's
Daryl.
Daryl. We have Cynthia, Alberta, I'm sure,
Yep.
and the deals.
Howdy.
Great.
All right, where are we?
Okay. Well, if anybody comes in, we'll make sure to greet them. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our St. Francis and Jesus Zoom Bible topical study. And we want to welcome you to an adventure. For some of us, an unfamiliar adventure, that is the exploration of the life of a saint. When I was in seminary, I learned that the Protestant reformers were not fond of saints, so we didn't spend much time on them. And unfortunately, I think I missed out a lot. So in the last 7 or 8 years, I have been actively pursuing my gap in knowledge. So I've spent time with St. Thomas and his marvelous adventures in India. Some of you joined me for that. St. Patrick, of course, and what a wonderful figure in history he is. And now, after our centuries, Jesus Through the Centuries book, thought it would be interesting to really dig into St. Francis. Middle Ages before the Reformation. Again, my training, nothing happens before 1500. So I have a lot to learn. Someone's gonna have to mute. Linda, try muting. Linda.
Pardon?
Try muting. We're getting echo. We getting echo now? No.
Nope, you're good.
When you want to talk, Linda, I'll stop, and so raise your hand or whatever. Linda's always got good questions. So anyway, when I started to look at St. Francis and started doing some reading and such, I thought, there's nothing like hearing from someone who has, a personal commitment as a follower. And so I began a search for a friendly Franciscan. I'm glad to say I found a very friendly Franciscan. Brother Louis Canter is with us tonight, and he is going to share his journey with Francis and be willing to go down any side trails we would like, and also any questions toward the end. But in order to be good hosts, let's take a turn introducing ourselves, and maybe one thing you know about Francis. One thing you know about Francis. Advent Square is going to be hard for you all to do that. I will talk to you later and find out, but let's go to Shirley Zimmerman. One thing you know about Francis.
He loved animals.
All right, you took the easy one.
Yes, I did.
How about BB?
He's from Assisi.
Ah, nice call. All right.
What?
How about the deals? It's going to get harder.
That's why I took that one.
Unmute.
I did.
He's the patron saint of animals, but he also had the stigmata, wasn't there?
Excellent.
Okay,
Teresa's our
that's what we got to
Teresa's-
say.
Teresa's our Catholic resident,
Dave too.
and Dave, yeah, more you than Dave. He skipped everything.
He's
All
got
right,
more years in
Lorraine.
Catholic school than me.
Lorraine and
More
Pat.
time.
Well, he wasn't always a saint. He didn't start off that way.
Okay, very good.
Well, of course, you introduced us at the Christmas Eve service about him starting the manger
Right.
concept for Christianity.
Yeah. Yeah. What a wonderful gift. Maxine, is there something you want to add about Francis?
The only thing I know is the animals.
Okay, we'll learn more then.
Yes.
Daryl, anything about St. Francis?
I think he wrote some wonderful prayers.
Very good. And some he didn't write, but that's okay.
Yeah. Like the peace part.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're going to end each session with a prayer that he didn't write, is worth using. So, Cynthia, Alberta, anything to add?
Yeah, I do. I've been to St. Francis of Assisi, and he has a place very high up there because it's already kind of on a mountain as far as I'm concerned, where he lived. But I walked up there, and I want to tell you, I saw the white dove.
Mm,
The dove. He loved birds
yeah.
and trees and the atmosphere and nature. Am
We'll
I
have to
right or
find out
wrong?
where you were, because that's fascinating. Alberta has
Well,
traveled.
where he lived.
Where
He
well,
lived there.
Wonderful. Excellent. Linda, anything about St. Francis? Or maybe a question?
They all got my 5 facts that I knew. That's it. That's why I'm here. I want to learn more.
All right. How about you, Mickey?
Okay.
She might not remember about unmuting.
Okay. Doug, anything you want to share about Francis, or are you here to learn?
here to learn. He was a follower of Jesus before it was cool. Or maybe after it was cool and before it became cool again.
I like that. Susan, anything you want to add?
I don't know, did we say anything about being a barefoot person, barefoot in
Mhm.
his?
His poverty. Yeah, boy, you guys covered a lot of bases. So now I'm gonna turn it over to Brother Louis, and he's gonna cover those and the rest. Let's greet him. And everybody go to mute, so it'll be easy for him to talk.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Pastor Andy for the opportunity to be with all of you tonight. I'm really excited about sharing about Francis. So let me give you a little background as to my own journey. So I've been with the Franciscans for over 51 years in terms of spirituality and direction. I belong to the first order in the Catholic Church for 18 years, and then left the community and then rejoined a ecumenical Franciscan community, which I still belong to at this time. And so we could talk about ecumenical, we could talk about the Catholic perspective, but what I really want to talk about is Francis himself. So I have a bunch of notes that I've taken down here, and I might even be able to share those with Pastor Andy to pass along afterwards if you're interested about who this guy is. So I know that you're going to be working with a book called Surrounded by Love, 7 Teachings of St. Francis by Murray Bodo. And it just happens that Murray Bodo is my spiritual director and has been for all 51 years. So I just retired from active ministry, and he just came to Lakeland where I was working we had a celebration, and I had asked if he wouldn't mind speaking about the little journey that him and I have been on together in terms of my own journey with Francis, but also just as a person. So that was really wonderful. So just so you had a little background, like I just didn't start reading about Francis yesterday, and I'm not sure, I'll be interjecting some of my own experience with this as well, because well, I'm following him and at least trying anyway. So let's say that let's put Francis into a time frame. So Francis was born in 1182 and died in 1226 in Assisi, Italy. So so what was the time like? What was the time like in Assisi at that time? First of all, it's the medieval period, so there was a lot of feudalism and serfism going on. So there would be lords of different towns, and so everybody wanted everybody's whatever they had. Sounds a little familiar in some ways. So what happened is there would be these wars between the towns, and so that was one of the areas, the images that was going on in the time of Francis in terms of history. In the church, there were a lot of mendicant orders, and a mendicant order is an order that wants to live the gospel radically. And so there was all these pop-up mendicant orders that were around Italy particularly, but even beyond. And some of them had the right approach and some of them did not. Some of them wanted to take all the riches from the bishops and the popes and give it to the poor, even if it meant causing harm. That was like how radical poverty they wanted to live. And it sounds a little bit like Robin Hood in some ways, except that the outcomes weren't always so positive. So the founders of these communities had a heart to follow Jesus and to live radically. It was that their message and the way that it occurred didn't work so well. And so that's important to have in mind too. So, you have these feudalism and serfism kinds of things going on. You have people who want to follow the gospel radically and were reacting against the richness of the popes and the priests of the time. and the bishops. So that's just some of the background that I wanted to share. Now, who was Francis before Francis? Francis was the son of a rich merchant. So he was a person of stature. He had money. His dad had money. Was the growing middle class was sort of who Pietro Bernardoni was. So he would go all over like France and some of these other areas and pick up cloth. And then he was selling cloth in Italy, in Assisi. And people would come from all over to buy things from him. And so he had amassed a small amount of money that would make him richer than most of the people of the time. His mother, Lady Pica, was a woman from France who had some royalty involved in her life. So she was called Lady Pica. And so these are the two parents of Francis. And so he grew up in a religious community because back in the medieval time, everybody was religious, supposedly. And so Francis was not, he was baptized and he was brought up into the Catholic faith. Francis was a fun-loving person. He was a party guy. The one guy that said is like he wasn't always Saint Francis. Absolutely correct. He wasn't. Francis had the dreams of what all guys of that period of time would want. They all wanted to be knights. They all wanted to be remembered as someone with, chivalry was an important thing. They loved to sing. So minstrels would be people that would be going around, and Francis was enamored by them. And of course, because his mother was French, he had learned French songs. And so whenever there was a party, they always wanted Francis to be there because he was a lot of fun. And so this combination of a fun-loving guy wanting to be a knight, a dreamer, his dad was a little worried about him. So when he said that he wanted to go to fight the Perusians because they were at war with Assisi, he was really glad that he would do that. So Francis went to fight in Perugia, was captured, was incarcerated for a year with other fellow Assisians, and he tried to keep a positive attitude and help that with the others. And this is all important why I'm bringing this up. But something happened when Francis was involved in that particular war. Many scholars would say that he suffered from post-traumatic syndrome. And so when he was released from prison, he went back to Assisi and had it took him over a year to recuperate from his experience in Perugia as a prisoner. He had a lot of time to think, a lot of time to reflect. Little seed of what was going to become occurred during that time. Francis got better, bounced back. Pope said that he wanted to have another crusade or another war or something. Francis said, "I'm your guy," asked his dad for a new horse and a bunch of armor and stuff. And he went off to do this. And he was sitting down not too far from Assisi, and he heard a voice speak to him. "Francis, is it better to serve the master or the servant?" And Francis responded, to serve the master. And voice said, "You go back to Assisi and I will tell you what you need to do." So Francis went back to Assisi, humiliated his father. And all of a sudden, here was Francis, like a confused individual, spending great deals of time in caves, praying, trying to figure out what this voice had asked him to do, and just kind of troubled. Let's just use that word. Well, and then Francis met a leper one day, and something compelled Francis, because lepers, as we all know, were like really the marginalized individuals in society. They were sick. You wouldn't touch them. You could catch what they had. So you never did anything with him. You helped him out when you could, but you would always keep your distance. In this case, Francis felt compelled to embrace the leper and to kiss him and to give him what he needed. And it was at that moment Francis realized that he was not only embracing the leper outside, but he was also embracing the leper inside as well. And so he began a journey of conversion and of deep prayer. And so he would be walking around in Assisi. Now, you're probably wondering, well, what was his parents thinking? They thought he was nuts. And such to a point that Pietro decided to have a showdown between he and his son in front of the bishop. And the bishop, the bishop didn't want, because Pietro was a man of money and power. He didn't want to ruffle his feathers, but he didn't know how to handle the situation, because here's a young man who really wants to follow Jesus. And so Pietro was all upset because Francis would take cloths out of his dad's store and sell it, get money, and then give it to the poor and to the lepers, and even to the church a little bit. So Pietro said to the bishop, I want my son to give me back what belongs to me. And so Francis said, I will give you back not only what you owe me, but I'm also giving back your name. And so the story is that Francis stripped himself naked and gave back all of his clothes to his father. And the bishop took his mantle and wrapped him around in his nakedness, which is a symbol of the church protecting Francis. And from that point on, Francis lived then as a hermit. And one day he went to a church, San Damiano, which is in the plains of Assisi. It was a broken down church. He would pray there often, but one day he went to pray there, and the cross that was there spoke to him. Jesus spoke to Francis and said, Francis, rebuild my church, for you see it is falling apart. Well, Francis was all excited. With Francis, it was all or nothing. He didn't do anything halfway. So Francis was like, okay, I need to build this church. So he was begging for rocks and looking for rocks and building. And in the meantime, praying. And people were really worried about him in Assisi. I mean, it was like, what's going on with Francis? But Francis knew that this was his mission. At least he thought the mission was to build that church. In the meantime, other young men in Assisi were attracted. People that were his friends were wondering what the heck was wrong with him. And there's many stories about, and I don't want to get into that because this is only supposed to go like 45 minutes. So anyway, people were attracted to Francis and what he was doing. And a couple guys that were his friends came to him and said, we want to do what you're doing. We want to do what you're doing. So then Francis got worried and said, we need to go to St. George, which is a church in Assisi, and we need the priest to open the Gospels for us. And whatever the Gospels say that we should do, that's what we will do. So the book was opened, and it says, to give everything that you have to the poor and then come and follow me. The next one was have no tunic, don't have a purse, don't have anything. And that was the second time. The third time said that wherever place you go, eat what's placed before you, preach what you want, what you're supposed to. And if people don't accept you, shake the dust from your feet and go to the next town. Francis and Bernard were so excited because they now had a direction that the Lord was saying that they should do. So Francis said, okay, Bernie, go home, get rid of all your stuff, then you come back and you can be a part of who we are. And so again, what happened, I'm moving rather rapidly. There was a significant amount of followers that he amassed. At some point, it was like between 7 and 9. And Francis said, we need to go to the Pope and ask the Pope what we should do, and to ask him to bless the life that we're living. So they all walked from Assisi to Rome. There's no cars or things like that or trains back then. So they walked because, and he was barefoot because he was poor, and everything was like basic. They went to the Pope, and at first the Pope would not receive him. Pope Honorius III would not receive him. So Francis was praying, and then at night the Pope supposedly had a dream, and he saw this little poor man holding up the church, St. John Lateran, which was the mother church for the Catholic community at the time. And he looked in the dream more deeply and realized that the man that was holding up the church was Francis. And so he called back and asked for Francis to come back to the meeting hall. Francis came back with the companions and had said, I bless what you're doing. Go and be fruitful and multiply. When you have more brothers, come back, and we'll go to the next level. And at that point, Francis was given permission to preach, and so he was made a deacon in the church. And off they went back to Assisi, all excited, living in a pig hut, which is what they called rivatorto, but the community continued to grow, and they would beg for food, they would beg for things. Francis would preach. He would go into the town square, and the first thing that he would say is "Buongiorno, buona gente," good morning, good people. That was his greeting at all times, so that he inherently believed that all people were good. So what does this mean, in short? In short, Francis loved Jesus so much that he was willing to give everything he had to live the gospel radically. He believed that what Jesus did is what he was supposed to do as well. And in the process of doing that, many people followed him. In a very short period of time, at least in our understanding, there were as many as 5,000 men throughout Europe who wanted to join and had joined the community. 5,000. And it wasn't just men. He had this really good friend. Her name was Claire. And Claire, again, was a woman of nobility. And Claire was enamored by what Francis was doing and decided that she wanted to follow him. Well, she couldn't be a friar because she was a woman. So what Francis had to do is to say, okay, if you really want to do this, then you're going to have to live in a convent, or you're going to, if you want to live this radical life, you're going to have to give everything that you have and follow Jesus just the way like we're doing too. And Claire said, I really want to do this because what you're doing is right. And what a wonderful thing that we could, if we could do this. So she went to a Benedictine convent for a while, and eventually, when San Damiano was finished, the bishop gave Claire that San Damiano, which is the mother church really for the Poor Clares, which still houses, did house the cross that spoke to Francis. And she began to have followers, and so the Poor Clares was birthed from that. As Francis continued his mission, Francis lay people that were married wanted to do the same thing. They wanted to live the gospel radically the same way Francis did. And so people would come to him and say, how can we do this? We're married, so we can't leave our wives. And he was really worried about that because a lot of the guys were doing that. They were leaving their wives to join the friars. And he said, well, we can't do that. I mean, marriage is holy and and we need people to get married so we can make more friars. So I just made that up, that part. And so Francis then said that we need to develop another community. So the third order, or the lay Franciscan community, was birthed. And so they would follow Francis. And so there was a huge crowd of those people who began to follow the way. Now, what's interesting about this is that in the rule for the third order, it says in there that people cannot take up arms. So if you were working for a lord in the feudal system, you would protect them. And what Francis systematically did is destroyed feudalism by just that one gesture of simply saying that those who will follow the way of Francis would not carry arms. And so that was in the rule. And so you can imagine that some of those lords were not real happy with Francis, because all of a sudden people were not taking up arms. And so feudalism was over. That whole concept and that whole caste system was kind of destroyed. And that's one reason why the middle class kind of rose as well. But that, again, that's economics. So, back to Francis, so what are some of the attributes of Francis that is attractive? You mentioned animals. And so Francis gave up everything, but in giving up everything, he received everything, and everything was a gift. He was not attached to stuff. He didn't find stuff. In fact, he abhorred stuff. And even with the order, he said ardently that we were not to hold on to anything. We were not to own anything, not even a donkey or a horse or the clothes on our backs. Everything we had, we begged for. And Francis was the example. So there are stories about Francis. And so they were all his brothers and sisters. And he believed that all creation, because Jesus came on earth and God became incarnate, God made everything in his image and likeness, all things became his brothers and sisters. And he believed that. And the Canticle of the Creatures speaks that very eloquently when he talks about brother sun and sister moon and brother wind and the stars. All creation became his brothers and sisters. And so he felt not only was he there to preach to humans, he was there also to preach to creation. And so there are stories where he had preached to the birds. If you read some of what we call the little flowers, the myth stories, and remember, a myth always has a kernel of truth to it. And whether or not Francis preached to the birds, maybe he did, but the important aspect of it is that all creation became his brother and sister, and therefore he then too was their brother. And so in ecology, in the understanding of the true sense of ecology, we as humans are part of the common home, the ecology of the world. And so Francis is the first ecologist. In fact, John Paul II, in our tradition, the Pope, had mentioned him and made him the patron saint of ecology. And so that's why. And so there's this whole thing with animals and him, the bird bath Francis and all those things, that all kind of comes out of that theology of incarnation, where he believed that God came to save all creation, not just humans. And so animate and inanimate objects became a source of delight for Francis, because he believed that God created them for all of us. And that's a wonderful, and for me as a Franciscan, that's huge. That's a big thing for me, because not only the issue of detachment is important, but it's also understanding that all creation is then my brother and sister, if I choose to really follow Francis and Jesus in a radical way. So that's one thing about Francis that's really important, and that's where that comes from. So that's a charism. The second charism is Francis is a man of peace. And so I alluded to the thing about no arms, but there are other situations that would identify Francis as a peacemaker. Let's look at the wolf of Gubbio. There's a story about a wolf that was like eating up all the animals and even humans, supposedly. Remember, Italians like to exaggerate a little bit. So in Gubbio, this animal was like, this wolf was eating up people's animals and maybe humans. And so people wouldn't even go outside because of this wolf. And they had asked Francis to come and speak to the wolf. and to tell the wolf to stop it. So again, this is a story, it's a myth. There's probably some truth to it. So Francis did go and talk to the wolf and said, look, you can't keep doing this. If the people of Gubbio see to it that you're well fed, would you quit harassing these people and eating up their animals? And it is said that the wolf nodded his head as if to understand what Francis said. And so the people of Gubbio were good on their end and making sure that he was fed, and he was good about not eating up their animals or people anymore. And it's said that in the Basilica of Francis, down in the crypt where Francis is buried, they have also found a skeleton of a wolf. I'm just leaving it there because there's a fact that there's a wolf in the in St. Francis's Basilica. That's all I'm going to say. So, and another story, Francis wanted to go to the Fifth Crusade to convert the Sultan. And so Francis went to Egypt with another companion and to do this. One of the things that happened in that journey is Francis saw just how horrible war is. He saw what hatred could do. He saw what weapons could do to humans. And he grieved that very, very deeply. So much so that they said that he just was torn apart by it. So when he got into the area with the Sultan, he was like a little afraid, and so was Maceo. Maceo was the brother that went with him. That's documented. Maceo was really handsome, and so he thought, because Francis said that he was so ugly, that with bringing Maceo with him would give him a chance. Anyway, the Sultan invited him into his court, and what wound up happening, this is scholar material, is that Francis and the Sultan immediately became very close friends. Why? Because deep down, the Sultan also wanted peace as much as Francis did. And so, again, not knowing how to do that, because we have this political thing going on both sides with the Christians and the Muslims, that there was a machine that was going on that was even beyond them in so many ways. But they did everything they could. They prayed together. They talked as much as one could, because, I mean, remember, Francis spoke Italian, and I am sure that the Sultan spoke Arabic. So I don't know how much talking went, but I think there was a lot of commonality in some of the things that Francis saw that the Sultan had. They had beads and they prayed the beautiful names of God, all 99. Francis had his beads. We had the 100 beads, and for Mary. This is from a Catholic perspective. You have to remember, I'm Catholic, so those are the things that I'm holding on to at that moment. So they said that after 5 or 6 weeks of being together, Francis had to go back to Assisi, and the Sultan wanted to give him like all kinds of stuff. But you don't give all kinds of stuff to someone you hate. And Francis, of course, refused all the gifts except for one gift, and that was a horn. And it was the horn that they used for the times that they would call, it was the call to prayer. In Islam, the community gathers together 5 times a day to pray, and it's by this horn. So Francis said, can I have the horn? So what he did is, when he went back to Assisi, he would use that horn to call the brothers to prayer. And he wrote his poetry in writing. Someone said that, his writing is beautiful. It is. So there was the 99 beautiful names of God that the Muslims would recite. Francis had his own names for God, that he wrote a poem for those names of God. They would pray 5 times a day. Francis asked the friars to pray 5 times a day. So what could we glean out of that was that Francis really wanted peace. He was a man of peace and desired peace. And so he was really the first ecumenical / interfaith person within the communities. Now, the Franciscan order is a mendicant order. Remember what I said earlier about the ones that weren't so good. The one thing about Francis that made him different than the rest is that he pledged the order under the obedience of the Pope and his successors, and that he would do whatever the Pope had asked him to do. That is not what other mendicant orders had done at the time. But Francis said that it was imperative that he was doing the will of God, and he believed that the will of God was spoken through the institution of the church. And so that the renewal of the church through Francis was from the inside out, not trying to do it from the outside in. And that's what saved Francis and saved the Franciscan order, because the Franciscans to this day are under obedience to the Pope and to a particular cardinal that has been identified for the first order. Now, my order, no. The order, I don't want to muddy the waters on that. So going back to Francis, I just want to make sure I'm telling all this stuff in order. So we identify Francis as an ecologist. We identify Francis as a peacemaker. We identify Francis as a man of prayer, a man of radical gospel values, and a man that believed very much that Jesus is the Son of God as well as the Son of Man, the Son of Mary. And so, yes, the story of Greccio, where Francis had the first nativity, that was very important to Francis that was done. Why? Because he wanted people to see how important the birth of Jesus was in the earth. Now, there's stories around that too, because he had the animals in this little crush area's cave. So they reenacted, there was the manger and there was the animals and all of that. And it was said that when Francis preached or read the gospel of the narrative from Luke when Jesus was born, it was said that the infant Jesus was made present in the manger. And so the miracle of the baby being present. And again, whether that happened or not, I don't know. I wasn't there, so I can only go by what is the stories. But what's more important is that to this day, everybody wants to have a creche in their homes that are Christian. Why? Because we remember the incarnation. And Francis is the one that really made us aware of how important it was that God came to us as a helpless child in poverty, not in richness. And so that's another gift that Francis gives. So you start adding up all these things that Francis was able to do. This is the charism that people are attracted to. Yes, Francis received the stigmata, which is the sacred wounds of Jesus, 3 years before his death. Brother Leo was with him, who was his constant companion. And so there's documentation again that occurred. And the way that happened was Francis was praying, and a seraph, which is a six-winged angel, came before Francis. And in the in the presence of Francis, this angel burned into his body the sacred wounds of Jesus, including the wound on his side. So he received the stigmata in both his hands, his feet, and in his side. And he hid them. He was very embarrassed by it. He was extremely humbled by it, and was only actually at the end of his life, when he actually died, that the brothers realized that he had received that. The only other person who knew that he received them was Leo, his constant companion. Leo was his constant companion. Leo was the one that wrote the Canticle of the Creatures down. Leo was the one that witnessed the stigmata. Leo also was the one to saw how Francis prayed. Francis was a very simple man. And so the prayer that Francis, so Francis and Leo were praying on Mount Sabazio, where maybe the one lady said that she was on Mount Sabazio, and there were lots of caves there. So they had two caves next to each other. And so Leo wanted to see how he prayed so he could be just like Francis. And so he pretended like he was asleep, and then he went out and went to where Francis's cave was. And he said that all he could hear was Francis sighing and saying, "Who are you, Lord, and what am I?" That's all Francis would pray. For the whole time that he prayed, "Who are you, Lord, and what am I?" And so, I have to tell you, that's a dangerous prayer, because I've used that prayer a lot, and God delivers, whether we like it or not. We'll find out who we are, and it isn't always so pretty, and I think we find out who God is. We find out that God is a loving and merciful God, a just God, a kind God. But I also find, in my own life, as how rotten I am, because how can I measure up? And so in one way, it's that prayer is cyclitic, because in knowing who I really am, then I can give my real self to God, and then allow him to be merciful to me, and allow me to experience his love, so I can share that with others. So it's really a great prayer in that regard. And that's an authentic prayer. That's a real prayer of Francis, that can be prayed. It's like a little mantra, who are you, Lord, and what am I? Who are you, Lord, and what? I can breathe it in and breathe it out. And it works. It really works. Okay, so that's one little thing. Francis had no love of, so you have this order of like 5,000 people. So someone has to govern that community, all right? And so for a long time, Francis was the head of the community. But about 3 years before, after receiving the stigmata, he said, "I just don't want to do this. I can't do this. I really want to pray. I really want to be just with Jesus, and I just need to do that." So he gave the responsibility of leadership to the order. He started giving that over to the brothers, and they were subdone, with little subgroups that we became houses, or sub communities with guardians and things like that. But Francis wanted to have nothing to do with the authority. He wanted to be under authority at all times. And so when the last rule, 1226, was approved by Innocent III, he just kind of said, I'm done. And shortly after that, Francis was always kind of ill, kind of a sick guy. And so, because he treated his body so horribly. I mean, he fasted all the time and lived in caves. And if you ever lived in a cave, even like for one day, and it's damp and it's dank, and you can get all kinds of diseases. And he had tuberculosis and rickets and all kinds of stuff. So at 46 years old, Francis gave up his spirit to the Lord. And true to form, being Francis who he was, it's all or nothing. Francis wanted to go to God as he was, naked. He came into the earth naked. He wanted to die naked and go back to God that way. And it was Brother Elias, who was the head of the order, saying, in obedience, you need to wear your habit. And so Francis reluctantly put the habit back on him. And on October 3rd, in 1226, Francis died. And so you would think that after that, and that time, remember it's 1226, that would be kind of like the end. The order would probably disperse or wane or whatever, but the opposite has occurred. And we're like 800 years out from, almost 800 years from his death. And we still are enamored by Francis and his spirituality, his radical love for Jesus, and his radical love for the gospel. And so Lady Poverty, because you'll see that if you're doing any writing, Lady Poverty came out of love. Francis didn't get poor or was intentionally poor for the sake of being poor. Francis did it because he loved Jesus. And he loved Jesus so much that he didn't want anything in the way. He found the pearl of great price. He knew that he had to sell the field, as Jesus tells us, so that he could not be distracted by any way. And so poverty was the vehicle for him to fully, as much as a human could be, unconditionally loving to God, to Jesus, to creation, and exuberate that sense of peace and wholeness, which is so attractive in Franciscan life, in Francis, and hopefully in the Franciscan spirituality and lifestyle that people who want to follow him do. So I've talked quite a bit there, and that's a lot to probably process. So what I would like to ask, is there any questions? I have some questions that I might ask you, but kind of process questions. I'm a process guy. So but what I would like to do is just kind of pause and say, so like, how does that fit for you? What is that? Does anything ring for you who have heard what I just said?
I just want to mention, brother, that not only do we have people from Boca Raton, but one of our guests tonight is from Bangladesh. And he is a mission pastor that we are supporting in Bangladesh. And just last week, he and some of his brothers took nothing with them and went on a 2-day mission journey, no food, no water. And he went to several of the villages that they've been serving in the spirit of Christ, and had, I think, a wonderful result of that. And his name is Russell, and he's with us.
Okay, great, Russell. Glad to be with you. Glad to hear that. I did something similar in 1990. I took a cross and walked 700 miles from Detroit, Michigan, and around Ohio to Covington, Kentucky, with just a cross. And I had a couple people that wanted to do the same thing with me. We walked. Some days we would have 7 people with us. Some days we had 150. And, we relied on the goodness of the people along the way to feed us and take care of us. And it was a powerful experience. Very humbling, but yes. So I get that. It was something that I wanted to do. I thought, you know what? So we just took a cross and just evangelized. It was low impact evangelization. And that's how Francis was too. He didn't beat people over the head and say, get right with Jesus like this minute. He would just plant seeds. And, and that's the beauty. Anyway, I'm going to stop talking because I could talk for a lot longer, but I won't.
Father, I noticed that you have a ring on your left hand.
Mm-hmm.
Is this a symbol like the nuns that they are married to Christ?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's about being in a relationship with Christ. And so it kind of, when I was younger and maybe a little more attractive, I was more concerned about that. So I'm older and bald and getting a little more withered. It doesn't have the same impact, I guess, as it did back then, But it reminds me also that I've done that, and so it keeps me also in check a little bit. So anything about Francis, or how does this settle with you? The people are kind of quiet, so I hope
everybody's still muted.
Oh,
I have a question. So he was Catholic. He wasn't a priest and
No.
and he didn't do sacraments, but serve
No.
communion or do anything else other than preach. And even at that, he still was affiliated with the Catholic Church, though, like you
Oh,
say,
absolutely.
under their authority.
Mhm.
Was he the first of his kind other than priests? Obviously, he was the very first.
Well, see, the Catholic Church has always had deacons.
Okay,
Um,
yeah,
and especially in the early centuries, we had deacons and deaconesses. No, I don't want to scandalize anyone, but
Yeah.
that up until the 3rd century, there were men and women deacons that were working for the bishop directly. And so the diaconate in the Catholic Church usually was a transition step toward priesthood back in in the seminary. So you would be you would be a deacon, and then you would be ordained a priest.
right.
The Pope had the authority to ordain Francis as a deacon. Francis did not want to be a priest because he didn't feel that he was worthy of that, and so he refused the opportunity. He wanted to have the ability to preach, and so by being ordained a deacon, that gave him permission to preach in churches. Because in the Catholic Church, unless you are a deacon or a priest, you cannot preach.
Okay.
Brother, and tell us a little bit about your personal lifestyle as a friar.
Well, my personal lifestyle is I try to live simply. So I don't have a lot of stuff. I spend time in prayer, and so the Gospels, the Gospels. That's our. In fact, I just read this again this morning. In our principles as the ecumenical Franciscan order, and remember, ecumenical means that I have brothers and sisters that are Lutheran, that are Quakers, that are Methodists, that are non-denominational, that are Presbyterian, all of that. And so, but the thing that holds us together is our Franciscan charism and spirituality and the gospel. Because the opening of our principles is that we live the gospel radically, and we go from gospel to life and life to gospel. That's the first principle in our community. So I go back to the gospel. I read the scriptures every day. I'm always asking, what is the scripture asking me to be today? How can I live that? And what is it that I can give to others based on that particular scripture? Now, some days are easier than others, obviously, but because some of the scriptures are a little more, I can't do much about divorce because I'm not married, so I don't have that dynamic. But again, also taking that into what did Francis do? How would Francis live that? What is, I ask myself those questions a lot. And so, so prayer is important. And being in tune with nature and the ecology is extremely important to me. And using the gifts that God has given me back. So living out my baptismal promises and the gifts that God has given me also allows me to live that Franciscan spirituality as well. But I live it in community. I'm bound to a community, and that's a part of it as well. I'm not by myself in that regard.
I think if we look at church history, the idea of following Jesus had fallen out of any kind of favor, really. The idea was for a priest to mediate the sacraments to people who needed to receive them. And so mainly your discipleship was, confessing your sins so you could receive the sacrament, and then receiving the sacrament and going on with your life. And Jesus wasn't even popular. He was almost scary in many ways, with the judgment of Jesus being part of people's mindset. In fact, Mary and the other saints were probably more popular in just piety in the average person's sense than Jesus. And so Francis really, I think, does return a concept of discipleship. Even the wonderful monastic orders before Francis followed more of a feudalism pattern, and they didn't really encourage. In fact, they were kind of thought Francis was crazy for encouraging this imitation of Christ. So he's really refreshing, because we lose track of a personal following in our cycles of church history. And I think he should be noted for really reviving that.
Absolutely. And the thing is that anyone can follow Jesus. I mean, it's if you hear the gospel, or and you're right, it's like in the Middle Ages, it's like it's all about fear, and anything that's unknown creates fear, and of course we as humans fill up what we don't know. That's just being human nature. And what Francis is saying, hey, don't fill it up with fear, fill it up with Jesus. Live the gospel. The gospel has all the answers, because Jesus walked on the earth just like you and I did. He was God and he was man, but he was man. And so we can do this. And with God, God will be with us. And, so yeah, that was the best part. That's why thousands of people followed him in his lifetime. It was like there was, I'm not exaggerating, that it was a revolution, and it was not intended. That was never his intention to start an order. It was just to follow Jesus. So there was something very radical and like you said, refreshing and hopeful, to pull them out of their darkness or their fear, or the judging God, that kind of stuff that was going on during the time. People they would go to church, but they watched. The priests were the ones that were doing all this stuff. The people out in the church, these magnificent buildings that they had created, they were on their own. So they developed their own piety, their own approach. And a lot of the theology was not so good. Again, because, most of the people weren't educated. They couldn't even read. And so they would create their own theologies about stuff. And some of it wasn't always the best. And Francis was the one that came in and said, hey, Jesus loves you. God is in everyone. And if God is in everyone, then we must love everyone as well.
So St. Francis was so popular, and amazingly, the popes did not crush him. They seemed to see in him, the good effort of God. But it took 800 years for us to get a Pope Francis.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, I don't know how to respond to that. I would just say that the Holy Spirit probably felt that this time around we needed a Francis, because he did take his, and at first when he was elected, they said that he was calling himself Francis. I thought Francis de Sales, because there's other Francises besides Francis of Assisi. And it was only a little bit later on, I think someone asked, so why Francis? And because he wants to take, Pope Francis is really doing a good job, and as much as one can, to relive that kind of radical spirituality of Francis. Francis Francis was obedient, but Francis would go on he would push the margins. And Franciscans are noted for that.
Father Cantor?
I'm not a priest. Thanks for ordaining me.
Hello?
Brother.
Yes. Yes.
Hi, I wondered, you mentioned that he revered inanimate objects as well as animals. And I mean, could you give an example of that? Of
Sure.
what you meant by
If you
that?
look, if you
Okay.
read, if you pray or read the canticle of the creatures, the sun, praise be my Lord for brother sun, who gives us warmth and happiness and air, and praise be to you, sister moon. So, I mean, the moon is not a living entity, nor is the sun, or is rain or wind, but he praised God for all of them because somehow they revealed who God was for Francis. And so
Mhm.
that was what was important to him. So fire we have sort of a parallel in some ways to the canticle of Daniel. If you've ever read that canticle, that starts with inanimate objects and ends with humans, but it's sort of in that vein of being able to praise God for everything that God has created, because it was made by God and God said that it was good. And Francis took that face value. Does that help?
Okay. Yes, thank you. Thank you. Yes.
Come on, Daryl, you always have a question.
Well, I was waiting. I'm not so question or comment, but I guess I'm in awe about his discipline in that era.
Mhm.
I mean, he was, I mean, like you said, the priests and popes in that time frame, if you studied history, were not exactly the shining stars of the leading the life of Jesus, and he was not critical.
No.
He just said, this is the way to go. And he was so disciplined, living in caves and just showing, what we're all supposed to. I almost wish you wouldn't be in caves, because the idea is to, what we all try to do is if we can strive to be an example to other people, to be better than what we are as humans with our sins. And he had such discipline that I wish he would have been more, from what you were describing, I wish he would have been more in the open so he could be recognized better than just, but obviously over the years, a lot of people have gone in that world.
Right. And so there's two things there. One is that Francis, in his admonitions to the friars, made sure that we would never, ever say anything bad about priests, because not even the worst priest in the whole wide world, in Francis's eyes, still was the only one that could make Jesus present by transforming the bread and wine into the body and blood of Jesus. And even the most unworthy servant, still unworthy priest, in his mind was elevated above all, because he was able to do that and no one else could. So that's very true. And the discipline, I think what I take from this as a follower of Francis, I mean, I can't live in a cave because I would be arrested in the 21st century. But what is it? What is it about the cave? I mean, Murray makes allusions to this in his book on Journey in the Dream. The cave is a place where you can encounter God. The cave was a place where Francis was able to pray. A cave is a place that is a shelter. And so how do I approach what I have as a house or where I live? Do I see it as something that owns me? Is it a place of prayer? Is it a place where I encounter God? Is it a place that others can encounter God when I invite them into my home? Those are just some questions that maybe we could look at ourselves and ask the question based on what Francis gives us as an example. I mean, I wish, that I kind of, that's kind of what I ask myself. It's like, so, am I such a fuss budget that if I invite somebody in the house and they move a chair, am I going to go back and move it right in front of them? Or am I going to live with letting that go until after the person's gone, or, it's just it's like, because that's hospitality. There's just a lot wrapped in that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's interesting. Is there, I know there's these, I'm trying to think with this order, all the brothers get together. Are there outside people that are invited in to experience this?
You mean
Or is it more solemn among
the
themselves?
Well, the chapters are when the friars gather for chapter, and I'll speak for my community. We gather every year for a chapter, and people can come and observe what we're doing, to a point. When we come to particular matters and stuff that are particular to the order itself, or voting, or consensus or things like that need to happen. That is really amongst ourselves, because people wouldn't understand what we're trying to do. So yes and no. I mean, when the community gathers for prayer, yes, we love to have people come. And when we gather for people are making profession in the community, or novicing in the community, that's open for people to be a part of. But when it comes to the work of the community itself, we kind of need to do that ourselves, because we need to be open. We need to be able to say what we really need to say, and it might scandal other people if they hear us being really honest with each other.
Daryl, the
Can I
idea
say
of,
something?
yeah,
Mhm.
please.
Can I say something?
Yes.
Sure,
This
Cynthia.
is Al,
Always.
no, this is Alberta speaking.
I know.
Cynthia is my daughter. But
Okay.
I wanted to say to brother that I was in a CC. And I was in a CC with a priest and all Catholics. I was the only Protestant. It was after my older sister passed away. And I was able to say the homily there. And I thought that was the most wonderful thing. But the reason I mention it is because that's where I went up and I saw up there on the hillside. You've been there, right? You're a
Mhm.
Franciscan.
Yes.
And do you know what I'm talking about?
Mm-hmm.
People don't know that. It was very peaceful and quiet up there.
Yeah, it is. It is very peaceful and quiet on Mount Sabazio. It is.
But you have to walk up to
Billion
get
steps.
there.
Mhm.
Oh, I couldn't do it today though. But I just wanted to be sure that it was there and I wasn't dreaming.
You weren't dreaming.
Thank you. Thank
So-
you. I know I wasn't. It was an absolutely wonderful, beautiful experience.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Alberta.
Daryl, the Franciscans were the only order that were not commanded to own and live in monasteries. They had to fight for that privilege. The Dominicans and others before them had a very strict order within these monastic communities, but St. Francis wanted them to be on the road. And that was the point, was they were supposed to be on the road. So he was on the road a lot. The idea that he was in the caves, I think it's the same as Jesus. Jesus was on the road and then Jesus withdrew. It's the same rhythm of needing to get in touch with God, and then also then to be able to go out and share. So I don't want to give the impression that we don't want to give the impression that the Franciscans were in like a cloistered situation. Now, some may choose that today, but Franciscans, I believe, brother, were among the most frequent missionaries around the world.
Yeah, they spread quickly. That's why we got 5,000 people pretty quick, in terms of that first order, because they did. And that wasn't without martyrdom. I mean,
Right.
within Francis's life, brothers were martyred because they had gone and proclaimed the word. So I mean, if you know, when I was saying that Francis wanted to follow the gospel radically, I meant in every way, and that included sending him out. You know, Francis had a little bit of a hard time between the going out and staying in. You know, there's the rule of the hermitage, and so that, but he actually asked Claire, remember I had talked about Claire, and another friar, to ask God if he should be cloistered or if he should go out on the road. And both of them came back saying that God said, you need to be on the road, Francis.
I
So-
appreciate that clarity, because I was getting the impression it was more seclusion.
No,
And I was trying to understand how that versus being the light on the hill. I was having a hard time with that. So yeah, I get a better picture of it now. Yes.
yeah. And when we would gather together, there was no houses. We had no buildings. They would gather out in the field. I mean, the chapter of mats really literally was the chapter of mats. It was a chapter, and the brothers had mats, and that's what they sat on and slept on. And so you can imagine all these men living, on the plain in front of the Assisi, meeting. I mean, it must have been an incredible sight to see that. But that's basically what they did. They don't. And Francis did not want us to own houses. He was really upset. There's a story that he had gone away, and when he came back, they were building a house for the friars, and he went up and started taking the tiles off the roof. Why? Because as soon as you do that, then you become monastic, and that was not the charism of the Franciscans. He had some trouble with some of the early leaders after before he died, because they felt that we needed some stability. And Francis said, no, that's not how Jesus lived. It says in the gospel that Jesus had no place to lay his head. If Jesus didn't have it, then we don't have it either.
So may I ask a question?
Yes.
So one of the things that is always, I was raised Catholic and in Catholic school. And one of the things that I've always, when I listen to this, and thank you so much. I mean, it's been wonderful this evening, learning from you. It's this period in the medieval period, when you're with this self-flagellation. And I don't know what the Franciscans did, but it was pretty prevalent back then. And when I listened to, following the ways of Jesus, that I was never taught that anything about this self-flagellation. Can you speak to that? Is that something outside of the realm of the Franciscans, or was it also practiced by?
Well, you have to understand, I would say some may have done that. I can tell you that I never did, but there were those who, so let me tell you why they did that. Because of Augustine. Or Saint Augustine, Thomas Aquinas. The whole thing is that the idea is that the body is bad and the spirit is good. So anything that has to do with the body, you have to get rid of it so that you're able to stay within the spirit realm. And so there's this disconnect between the body and the spirit. And so if the body is evil, you have to beat whatever's out in there out. And some people actually literally did that. And Francis, while I don't recall him ever flagellating himself, Francis was very severe on his body. And to a point where toward the end of his life, he had said to the brothers, he said that he was really bad to Brother Ass, and he would call his body Brother Ass. And he would do some things that were pretty weird, like rolling in the snow, if he was being tempted. and so there was something about thorns, and there's a story about that. So I mean, but remember, in the medieval period and beyond, even now, in some instances, people believe that the body is bad, and so you have to discipline it. The idea that God came as in the human body somehow got misguided or something. The body is good because God created the body to be good. Now, what we do with it may not be so good, and that's another thing. But this is that. But in that period of time, there was this thing of the body is evil, it causes sin, and the spirit does not. Does that make
Thank
that?
you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Yeah. And so, yeah, it's only been recently actually since, post-Vatican II, that we began to revisit the earlier theologies of the church, of the Christian community. Let me just say it that way, and realizing that God created everything in his image and likeness and said that it was good. So how could the human body be bad if God created it to be good? I mean, then what we're saying is that Genesis and the story of creation then somehow was tainted. And how could God?
Your church.
So it's looking at those things from that perspective. And I think from a Franciscan spirituality, it's like looking at the body and soul integratively. I can't live without a body, at least humanly, but I can't live without a soul either, because that soul is what's drawing me into the next creation, which is heaven. It's how I live this gift that God has given me as authentically as possible in light of the gospel, that draws me into that deeper relationship with Jesus and God. And so the body is my vehicle. I should take care of it. It should be taken care of. Not, yeah. So temptation is what it is. It's what we do with the gifts that God gives us. I hope that helps a little bit.
So one
Yes,
last
thank you.
question, brother. We're gonna wrap up here pretty quickly, but I didn't get a chance to also mention to you all that brother spent his career and is continuing, I think, to minister in music. Our director at Advent Square, our senior living community, can't be with us tonight, but she is also in part of her vocation a cantor, actually, at her Catholic church. But tell us how Franciscan spirituality has informed your musical ministry, because I'm fascinated by that connection.
Well, it has, again, because when you go to the friars or you go to the order, they ask this question: what can you do? So like some communities, they're teachers or preachers or whatever. The Franciscans will take whatever we got. Why? Because we believe that God gives us gifts at baptism. And so I've been given a gift of music. And so the way that I've integrated my Franciscan spirituality with that is that I'm a composer. So I've written almost all the prayers of Francis into songs. And so, and we all know that, we learn things by singing. So like I learned my ABCs by the ABC song. So I learned about, keeping in mind the creation of God's creation by singing the Canticle of the Creatures, or praying before the crucifix, the song about praying before the crucifix. Or I've written a mantra based on, who are you, Lord, and what am I? So, well, maybe sometime I might be able to come and do a little concert or something. I don't want to put anything in Pastor Andy's mind or anything, but to develop that more, to understand, that whatever gifts we have, God's blessed those. And so we're called to give those back, give them back to God 100-fold. And I think that's very Franciscan, because then I'm not holding them back for myself. That's that sense of ownership. The detachment is giving it away. And Francis was a musician himself in a fashion. When he would get really excited, he would take two sticks together and play a fiddle. It would look like he was playing a fiddle. He would sing. He would sing songs. He would break into French when he was exceedingly happy. He would break into French, singing songs in French. So it's very much a part of the charism of Francis. And as you read through this book by Murray, you'll unpack even more information. What I did is very skeletal in many ways. I just wanted to give you some things to put some hooks on regarding Francis.
Well, you certainly did. It's such a pleasure and an honor to have you with us tonight. You started off our adventure in a wonderful way. And I just want to, we'll be praying for your retirement to be a wonderful new adventure, serving the Lord in other ways. And certainly keep this little Lutheran church in your prayers.
Absolutely.
As we, get to know St. Francis, and more importantly, of course, get to closer to following Jesus with our lives. I wanted to, we have a favorite prayer. It's called the Prayer of St. Francis. And I was, like many, disillusioned to find out he didn't write it. He wrote wonderful things, and we'll talk about the wonderful things he wrote, but he didn't write this one. However, it's in the spirit, I think, Francis. So I thought we might want to end this session and our future sessions with this prayer. And just because it's as crazy on Zoom, if you all can mute or just say it silently as we share. Can everyone see that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair,
hope.
Where there is darkness, light. And when there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you again, brother. And
you're welcome. Thank you all
Yeah,
very
thank
much.
you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll see you all next Monday night, 7 o'clock or sooner. God bless.
God bless.
Okay, thank